I was 18 and had just moved to California to start my freshman year at Golden State University. Classes were set to begin in a few days, but I wanted to take advantage of the time to explore my new surroundings. The area around the campus was renowned for its scenic beaches, dense forests, and rugged cliffs. Being an avid nature enthusiast, I decided to explore one of the coastal trails. After some online research, I found a trail that seemed perfect, a 2-hour hike along the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It promised breathtaking views and a good workout, so I packed light, carrying only a water bottle and my phone. When I arrived at the trailhead, I noticed that there were no other cars parked, which led me to believe I had the trail all to myself. About 10 minutes into my hike, I came across another hiker. He was sitting on a large rock, looking out at the ocean. He nodded at me as I passed, and I returned the gesture. He appeared to be on his way out, as he was sweating and looked somewhat exhausted from his hike. I continued along the trail, listening to my favorite playlist and enjoying the salty breeze. After another half-hour of walking, I heard someone calling out. Turning around, I saw the same man waving at me to get my attention. Confused, I took out my earbuds and waited for him to catch up. "Are you on the Pacific Overlook Trail?" he asked, slightly out of breath. "Yes, I am," I replied. He pointed to my right, indicating a narrower, almost hidden path leading into a dense grove of trees. "That's the correct trail," he said. "A lot of people miss it and get lost." I thanked him, albeit a bit puzzled. His suggestion seemed plausible, given the overgrown vegetation, and he appeared genuinely helpful. As I started down the path he indicated, he continued to walk behind me. He explained that he lived nearby and hiked these trails almost daily. He hated to hear about new hikers getting lost and injured out here. His explanation made sense, and I engaged in small talk, not having much of a choice since he was right behind me. However, after a few minutes, our conversation dwindled, and we walked in silence for a while, still close but not speaking. The trail meandered through the dense forest, and it wasn't long before I realized we had been walking for over an hour. The hike was supposed to loop back, but there was no sign of it doing so. Just as I was beginning to feel uneasy, I stumbled over something hard, an old rusty railroad track, almost hidden under the foliage. Surprised, I looked up to see an old abandoned lighthouse not far from the trail. It was a small structure, weathered by time and the salty sea air, with ivy climbing its stone walls and shattered windows. The rusty tracks led right up to its door. Intrigued, I approached the lighthouse and peered inside, but the darkness inside was impenetrable. The interior was pitch black, with no hint of how far it extended or what lay inside. As I stood at the entrance, the man caught up with me. He was now only a few feet away, and his demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the friendly, helpful expression. His face was now stern, almost menacing. "Go in," he said, his voice cold and emotionless, a stark contrast to his earlier friendliness. It was a command, not a suggestion. Fear surged through me, and I bolted without a second thought. I could feel his presence behind me, but he didn't give chase. Once I reached the dense trees, I glanced back and saw he had disappeared, likely retreating into the lighthouse. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Breathless and shaken, I quickly started my car and sped away from the trailhead. That experience was a harsh awakening to the potential dangers of trusting strangers. What could have ended in a disaster taught me to be more cautious. As I recounted the incident to my friends later, they were horrified. We speculated endlessly about the man's intentions and the lighthouse's mystery. In the end, I reported the encounter to the local authorities, who promised to look into it. That unsettling hike remains etched in my memory, a reminder of the importance of staying vigilant and cautious, especially when exploring unknown places alone. Despite the initial shock, it didn't dampen my adventurous spirit. Instead, it reinforced my resolve to be more prepared and aware of my surroundings. Over the years, I continued to explore California's beautiful landscapes, but I always carried more supplies, informed someone of my plans, and stayed on well-marked trails. My encounter with the mysterious man was a turning point, making me a more cautious and conscientious hiker. Ultimately, the lesson learned from that eerie day has kept me safe on countless adventures, each one an opportunity to grow, learn, and appreciate the beauty and unpredictability of the natural world. It was 2016, and I was living alone in a small cabin deep in the rural outskirts of the New England countryside. My home was isolated, with the closest neighbor miles away. Rarely did anyone come by, except for the occasional delivery person. On this particular day, after a long shift at the local diner, I left work at 8 p.m. and embarked on the hour-long drive home, arriving around 9 p.m. As I drove up my gravel driveway, I noticed something unusual: a man standing at my front door. Given the remote location and the late hour, I was understandably startled. There wasn't a vehicle in sight, adding to the oddness of the situation. Parking my car cautiously, I stepped out, scanning my surroundings as I approached the front door. The man appeared to be in his late 20s. He wore a broad smile and waved as I neared. "What are you doing here? I think you have the wrong house," I said, moving past him to position myself between him and the door. He explained that he was lost and needed directions to get into town. It was a peculiar request, especially since he had no car, and his presence at my isolated cabin was already questionable. Nevertheless, I told him to head back to the road and take a left, which would lead him straight into town. Despite my clear directions, he continued to stand there, smiling and attempting to engage me in conversation. His tone was unmistakably flirtatious, which felt highly inappropriate and eerie given the circumstances. I tried to cut the conversation short multiple times, but then he asked if he could come inside to warm up. I firmly declined. Undeterred, he continued to press, but I reiterated that he was not welcome inside. I quickly entered my cabin, locking the door behind me. For a moment, I debated calling the police, but I watched through the window as he finally walked down the driveway and disappeared into the darkness toward the road. Relieved, I tried to relax, grabbing a drink and settling on the couch with my laptop to watch a Netflix show. I was exhausted and soon dozed off. Not long after, I was jolted awake by a knock at the door. The knocking was persistent, and a woman's voice called out, asking for me. My heart raced as I recognized the voice. It was the same man from earlier, but now he had accomplices. Instead of opening the door, I peeked out the window to confirm my suspicion. What I saw sent chills down my spine. Nearly a dozen men were outside my cabin. Some were scattered among the trees lining the driveway, while others were right up near the porch, waiting. Terrified, I called the police, my hands shaking as I described the situation. The men were moving around, talking in hushed tones. I overheard them mentioning another house, but I couldn't piece together their intentions. Despite the ominous gathering, they never attempted to break in. The woman continued to knock and call out for me, maintaining the facade. When the patrol car finally appeared at the end of the driveway, the group scattered, sprinting into the dense woods that surrounded my cabin. They disappeared into the forest, which offered no paths or roads, just impenetrable wilderness. 3 days later, I received horrifying news. A neighbor who lived in a house further down the road had gone missing. His front door was found unlocked, and the house showed no signs of forced entry. It appeared as though he had simply vanished. The realization hit me hard. I could have easily been in his place. My encounter with those people took on a more sinister meaning, knowing that I had narrowly escaped a similar fate. This experience left me shaken and hyper-aware of my isolation. I installed additional locks, reinforced my windows, and became much more vigilant. The encounter was a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the most tranquil of settings. Living alone in the countryside, I had always appreciated the solitude and peace, but this event cast a long shadow over my sense of security. It was a stark lesson in the vulnerability of isolation and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. I'm a taxi driver in New York City, and one night I found myself working a later shift than usual. A morning appointment had pushed my start time to well past 8 p.m. It was my first time working this late, and I was unsure about how busy it would be. By 11 p.m., I'd only completed 4 fares. I considered switching to food delivery for the night, hoping for better luck. But then, another ride request came through. It was a 35-minute drive, promising a decent fare, so I accepted it and headed to the pickup location. The pickup spot was a nearly deserted subway station a few blocks away. As I pulled into the parking lot, I slowly drove around, looking for my passenger. After making a full circle and seeing no one, I parked and waited. The lot was empty, and it didn't look like any trains were running at that hour. Just as I was about to text the rider, I noticed a man approaching my car. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. Aside from confirming the ride was for him, he didn't speak. We began the drive in silence. The man sat motionless in the back seat, not even taking out his phone. He just stared ahead, making the already quiet ride even more unnerving. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror a couple of times, and each time his eyes were locked onto mine. It wasn't uncommon for passengers to look at me, but there was something deeply unsettling about his gaze. After a tense, 35-minute drive, we arrived at the drop-off location. It wasn't a recognizable address, but a specific spot the passenger had marked on the map. The location was at the end of a deserted street, bordered by an empty, fog-covered lot. I looked back in the mirror, seeing the man still seated, unmoving. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and menacing. Unsure if I heard him correctly, I turned to face him. His eyes bore into mine with a terrifying intensity. He repeated, "Get out." My body tensed with fear, and before I could react, I saw several figures emerging from the fog. 3 or 4 men, all dressed in dark hoodies and carrying bats or knives, rushed toward my car. They reached the vehicle just as I slammed it into drive, but not before yanking the back doors open and trying to climb in. The man inside the car lunged at me, attempting to open my door, likely to throw me out. In a panic, I hit the gas, and the car lurched forward. The attackers clung to the doors briefly before being thrown off as I picked up speed. The man inside lost his balance, fell into the back seat, and then jumped out of the moving car, disappearing into the fog with the others. I sped away, my heart pounding, until I reached a gas station a few miles down the road. The back doors were still swinging open, and my car had several new dents from the attack. I called the police, and soon an officer arrived to take my report, while another went to investigate the scene. The attackers were nowhere to be found, but they did recover a phone on the road. It turned out to be the one used to book the ride, and it had been reported stolen less than an hour before I picked up the man. This seemed like an elaborate plan to rob people, including me. It's chilling to think what might have happened had they succeeded in getting me out of the car. They probably intended to steal the vehicle and prevent me from contacting the police right away. Reflecting on that night, I realized how lucky I was to escape. The experience was a stark reminder of the potential dangers that come with my job, especially when working late in a city that never sleeps.